The Galactic Council chambers buzzed with the usual mixture of translated voices, each species contributing to the cacophony in their own distinct way. The massive crystalline dome overhead filtered the light from 3 different stars, casting rainbow patterns across the assembled delegates. It was here, in this grand hall that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, that humanity was about to make its most humiliating debut. Commander Sarah Chen stood at the center of the speaking circle, her simple blue uniform looking pathetically plain compared to the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by the other species representatives. The Zilithians draped themselves in living metal that shifted and flowed like liquid mercury. The Corvan delegation wore robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of space itself, complete with tiny stars that twinkled in real time. Even the insectoid Threx had managed to polish their carapaces to a mirror shine that reflected the chamber's lights in dazzling patterns. Sarah's uniform had exactly 3 decorations: a small Earth flag patch, her rank insignia, and a faded commendation ribbon from the Mars Colony Defense Force. She might as well have been wearing pajamas for all the impression she was making. The Galactic Council had been expecting humanity for over 50 years. Ever since Earth had developed faster-than-light communication and sent out its first tentative messages into the void, the various species had been watching, waiting, and frankly, betting on how quickly the newest sapient race would either destroy itself or prove useful enough to join the greater galactic community. The early reports had not been encouraging. Humans were young, barely 10,000 years past their hunter-gatherer phase. They had only recently developed space travel, and their first attempts at colonizing other worlds had been marked by the kind of disasters that made experienced spacefaring civilizations wince. The Mars incident alone, where an entire colony had nearly been wiped out by a dust storm because someone forgot to properly calibrate the atmospheric processors, had become something of a legend in certain circles. But it was not just their technological inexperience that made the other species doubt humanity's potential. It was their biology, their psychology, their entire evolutionary background that seemed to mark them as permanent second-class citizens in a galaxy full of apex predators and hyper-intelligent beings. Take the Zilithians, for example. They had evolved from crystalline beings on a high-gravity world where survival meant perfect coordination between multiple connected consciousness nodes. A single Zilithian could think in parallel processing streams that made human supercomputers look like pocket calculators. They had solved faster-than-light travel not through engineering, but through mathematical proofs so elegant that other species still studied them as art forms. The Corvan Empire had originally been a hive mind species that had deliberately fragmented itself into individuals in order to increase creative potential. Each Corvan carried within them the genetic memory of their entire species, stretching back millions of years. They did not need to study history because they had lived it, collectively, as a people. When they spoke of the rise and fall of galactic civilizations, they were recounting personal experiences. And then there were dozens of other species, each with their own incredible advantages. The hegemony of shells had evolved in the crushing depths of gas giant atmospheres, giving them the ability to survive in environments that would instantly kill most other life forms. The Singing Worlds Collective could manipulate matter at the molecular level through harmonic frequencies that they produced naturally. Compared to these evolutionary marvels, humans seemed almost embarrassingly ordinary. They were bipedal mammals who had evolved on a gravity-standard world under a single yellow star. Their brains operated on slow, linear processing. They had no natural abilities beyond basic tool use and pattern recognition. Their lifespan was absurdly short by galactic standards, barely long enough to accumulate any meaningful expertise before they died and had to start over with the next generation. Even worse, they seemed to have evolved not as apex predators, but as persistence hunters. This meant that their primary survival strategy was essentially to follow prey animals around until the prey became too exhausted to continue running. It was the kind of hunting strategy that suggested a species too stupid to figure out better ways to catch food. The preliminary psychological profiles had been even more damning. Humans appeared to be irrationally aggressive, prone to violence over minor resource disputes, and incapable of maintaining stable governmental systems for more than a few centuries at a time. Their planet was currently divided into nearly 200 separate political entities, most of which seemed to spend their time threatening each other rather than working together to solve common problems. Ambassador Crix of the Zilithian Collective had been particularly vocal about his concerns. "We have observed this species for decades," he had said during the preliminary hearings. "They wage war over religious differences, territorial boundaries, and economic systems. They have weapons capable of destroying their entire biosphere, and they have come close to using them multiple times. Why exactly are we considering them for membership?" The question had been a valid one. The Galactic Council had very specific criteria for membership, and most of them seemed designed to keep species like humanity out rather than invite them in. Prospective members needed to demonstrate technological sophistication, cultural stability, and the ability to contribute meaningfully to galactic civilization. Humanity had managed exactly one of those three criteria, and barely. Their technology was functional but crude, like stone tools compared to the elegant solutions developed by more advanced species. Their culture was fractured and chaotic, with no unifying principles beyond a vague tendency toward individual liberty that most species found baffling. As for contributions to galactic civilization, it was hard to see what humans could offer that was not already available from more advanced species. But there were protocols to follow, and the Council took its responsibilities seriously. Every sapient species deserved at least the opportunity to present their case for membership. It was one of the fundamental principles that had held the galactic community together for over 1,000,000 years. So here was Commander Chen, standing in the center of the Great Hall, representing all of humanity to a collection of beings who had already decided that her species was not worth their time. The formal proceedings began with the ritual acknowledgement of first contact protocols. Sarah recited the words she had memorized, though she suspected that her pronunciation of the ancient formulaic phrases was probably causing some of the translator devices to malfunction. The original language had been developed by a species that communicated through electromagnetic pulses, and human vocal cords were not really designed to reproduce the subtle frequency modulations that gave the words their proper meaning. After the formalities, Sarah was invited to present humanity's case for membership. She had spent months preparing for this moment, working with Earth's finest xenobiologists, sociologists, and diplomatic experts to craft a presentation that would showcase humanity's potential despite their obvious disadvantages. She began with Earth itself, displaying holographic images of her homeworld's diverse biosphere. The other species had seen similar presentations from dozens of other worlds, but Sarah hoped that Earth's particular combination of environmental factors might be interesting enough to catch their attention. "Earth is a world of remarkable biodiversity," she said, as images of rainforests, coral reefs, and African savannas rotated slowly above the speaking circle. "Our planet hosts millions of different species, creating ecological networks of incredible complexity and resilience." There was polite interest from the assembled delegates, but Sarah could see that she was not telling them anything they had not heard before. Biological diversity was common throughout the galaxy, and several species had homeworlds that made Earth look positively barren by comparison. She moved on to human achievements, highlighting their rapid technological development and cultural accomplishments. The problem was that every achievement she could cite had been accomplished by other species thousands or millions of years earlier. Humans had developed writing systems, but so had everyone else. They had created art, music, and literature, But again, these were universal characteristics of sapient life. The longer Sarah spoke, the more she could feel the attention of the council drifting away from her. Delegates began having quiet conversations among themselves, their translation devices creating a low hum of background noise that made it clear that humanity's presentation was not exactly holding their interest. Ambassador Crix finally interrupted her about 20 minutes into the presentation. "Commander Chen," he said, his crystalline form pulsing with patterns that the translator rendered as polite but firm disagreement. "While we appreciate humanity's enthusiasm for joining our community, perhaps you could explain what unique capabilities your species brings to the Council. What can humans do that we cannot already do better?" It was the question Sarah had been dreading, because the honest answer was nothing. Humans could not think faster than Zilithians, could not manipulate matter like the singing worlds, could not survive in extreme environments like the hegemony of shells, and could not draw upon millions of years of genetic memory like the Corvan Empire. She tried to pivot to human creativity and adaptability, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they sounded hollow. Every species claimed to be creative and adaptable. It was like claiming to be intelligent or capable of learning. These were basic characteristics of sapient life, not unique advantages. The Corvan representative, an elderly individual whose name translated roughly as "deep current of ancient wisdom," leaned forward in his floating chair. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "humanity would benefit from a longer period of development before attempting to join the galactic community. Many species find it useful to spend several millennia perfecting their civilization before taking on the responsibilities of council membership." It was a diplomatic way of saying that humans were not ready for the big leagues, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Sarah could see nods of agreement from representatives of at least a dozen different species. The consensus was building that humanity should be politely declined and invited to reapply in a few thousand years. Sarah tried one last desperate gambit, talking about human curiosity and their drive to explore the unknown. She mentioned the successful colonies on Mars and Europa, the research stations throughout the solar system, and humanity's eagerness to learn from more advanced civilizations. But even as she spoke, she could see the Threx delegate accessing what appeared to be a holographic database, probably reviewing the files on humanity's colonial failures. The Mars incident was there, certainly, but so were the oxygen processor malfunction on Europa that had killed 37 colonists, the reactor breach on the Titan research station that had required evacuation of the entire facility, and the infamous coffee spill incident on the asteroid mining platform that had somehow resulted in the destruction of 3 months' worth of refined metals. When Sarah finally finished her presentation, the silence in the chamber was deafening. She had been allotted 2 hours to make her case, but she had run out of meaningful things to say after 45 minutes. Council Speaker Threnx, a member of a species that looked like a cross between a tree and a telescope, activated the formal response protocols. "The Council thanks Commander Chen for her comprehensive presentation," he said in the tone of voice universally used by beings who were about to deliver bad news diplomatically. "We will now begin formal deliberations on humanity's application for membership. Commander Chen, you may remain in the observer's gallery during our discussions." Sarah walked to the designated area with as much dignity as she could manage, knowing that she had just witnessed the failure of humanity's first attempt to join the galactic community. Behind her, the real discussion was beginning, and she did not need a translation device to understand the tone of the conversation. They were being polite about it, but the message was clear. Humanity was not ready for this level of responsibility. They were too young, too inexperienced, and too primitive to be trusted with the secrets and technologies that came with council membership. As she settled into the observer's gallery, Sarah tried to tell herself that this was not the end of the world. Humanity would have other chances, other opportunities to prove themselves worthy of membership in the galactic community. But she could not shake the feeling that she had just failed not only the Council, but her entire species. The worst part was that the Council was probably right. Humans were newcomers to the galactic stage, and they had a lot to learn before they could stand as equals among species that had been perfecting their civilizations since before Earth's continents had formed their current shapes. But as the formal deliberations continued around her, Sarah found herself thinking about something that had not come up in her presentation: humanity's tendency to rise to meet challenges that seemed impossible. Throughout their history, humans had consistently managed to accomplish things that should have been beyond their capabilities, often through sheer stubborn determination rather than superior ability. It was not the kind of thing that looked impressive in a formal presentation to a galactic council, but it was real, and it was uniquely human. The question was whether they would ever get a chance to prove it. The council's deliberation lasted exactly 37 minutes, which Sarah understood was considered a respectfully long time to spend discussing an obvious rejection. She watched through the observation gallery's transparent aluminum barrier as the representatives consulted their databases, exchanged brief comments with their colleagues, and performed the various ritual gestures that different species used to indicate formal disagreement. Ambassador Crix's crystalline form pulsed with the slow, methodical patterns that indicated careful consideration of evidence. The Corvin representative floated in his chair, occasionally interfacing with the collective memory banks that contained the wisdom of his entire species. Even the normally energetic Threx delegates had settled into their contemplative poses, their compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lights as they processed the information they had just received. Sarah did not need to hear the final verdict to know what it would be. The body language, energy patterns, and electromagnetic signatures of the assembled delegates all pointed to the same conclusion: humanity was not ready for council membership. When Council Speaker Threnx finally called for the formal vote, the result was exactly what Sarah had expected. 47 species voted to defer humanity's application for a minimum of 500 galactic standard years. 3 species abstained, citing insufficient data. 0 species voted in favor of immediate membership. The Council recognizes humanity's potential, Speaker Threnx announced, his translation device rendering the formal language in tones that managed to sound both encouraging and patronizing at the same time. However, we believe that your species would benefit from additional development time before assuming the responsibilities of full membership. We invite you to reapply when humanity has achieved greater technological sophistication and cultural stability. Sarah stood and delivered the formal acceptance speech that she had memorized for exactly this situation. She thanked the Council for their consideration, expressed humanity's continued interest in eventual membership, and promised that Earth would use the intervening centuries to address the concerns that had been raised during the deliberation. It was all very diplomatic and polite, but Sarah could feel the weight of failure settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She had been given the chance to represent her entire species to the galaxy's most powerful governing body, and she had failed completely. The formal session concluded with the ritual expressions of mutual respect and the hope for future cooperation. Sarah gathered her materials, accepted the polite condolences from the few delegates who bothered to approach her, and made her way toward the exit. She was halfway to the transportation hub when the emergency alarms began. The sound was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard before. It was not the sharp, piercing tone of human emergency systems, but something deeper and more complex. The alarm seemed to resonate through multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating harmonic patterns that made her teeth ache and her vision blur slightly around the edges. Throughout the council chambers, delegates who had been calmly filing out of the session suddenly froze in place. Sarah watched as the Zilithian representatives' crystalline forms began pulsing in rapid, chaotic patterns that looked nothing like their earlier measured communications. The Corvan delegates abandoned their floating chairs and began moving toward wall-mounted communication panels with urgent, jerky movements. The Threx delegation was the most dramatic in their reaction. All 6 members suddenly clicked into perfect synchronization, their individual personalities apparently subsumed into some kind of emergency collective mode. They moved as one toward the chamber's central command console, their compound eyes reflecting the flashing alarm lights as they accessed data streams that Sarah could not even begin to interpret. "Attention all council members and guests," Speaker Threnx's amplified voice boomed through the chamber, the usual calm dignity replaced by something approaching panic. "We are receiving emergency transmissions from the Outer Rim territories. Multiple colonies report contact with unknown hostile entities. All non-essential personnel are directed to emergency shelters immediately." Sarah found herself caught in a flood of beings moving toward the designated emergency areas, but her military training kicked in almost automatically. Instead of following the crowd toward the shelters, she pushed against the flow of traffic and made her way toward the central command area. No one stopped her. In the chaos of the emergency response, one human in a plain uniform was not worth anyone's attention. Sarah managed to reach an auxiliary monitoring station just as the first detailed reports began coming in from the affected colonies. What she saw made her blood run cold. The main display showed a tactical overview of the galaxy's outer spiral arm, where the youngest and most recently established colonies maintained a thin line of civilization against the unknown dangers of deep space. Normally, the display would show the steady green indicators that represented thriving worlds, active communication links, and regular commerce between systems. Instead, Sarah was looking at a spreading pattern of red warning indicators that represented worlds that had gone completely silent. The first reports had come from New Geneva, a Corvan research colony that specialized in xenoarchaeology. The last transmission had been a fragment of panicked communication that ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence. Similar reports were coming in from worlds throughout the sector, brief, terrified messages that cut off without explanation. But it was the visual data that truly drove home the scale of the disaster. The few colonies that still had functioning communication systems were transmitting real-time footage of the attacks, and what Sarah saw challenged everything she thought she understood about the nature of life in the universe. The entities attacking the colonies did not appear to be any kind of recognized life form. They moved through space without ships, seemed to ignore the basic laws of physics, and left behind them a trail of destruction that defied rational explanation. Where they passed, matter itself seemed to break down into component particles, creating expanding zones of what could only be described as anti-reality. "By the ancient crystals," Ambassador Crix whispered, his translated voice carrying harmonics of terror that Sarah had never heard from a Zilithian before. "They consume the very fabric of existence." The Corvan representative who had recommended that humanity wait a few millennia was now frantically accessing the collective memory banks of his entire species, his movements becoming increasingly desperate as he searched through millions of years of accumulated knowledge. "There is no precedent," he reported, his usual calm completely shattered. "In all the recorded history of our people, we have never encountered anything like this." Sarah watched the tactical display update in real time as more colonies went silent. The pattern of destruction was not random. The entities were moving with purpose, following specific vectors that suggested intelligence and planning. They were not just mindless forces of destruction, but something that could think, plan, and coordinate attacks across multiple star systems simultaneously. "Council Speaker," one of the Threx delegates called out, its voice carrying the mechanical precision that indicated full collective processing mode. Our analysis suggests that the entities are advancing toward the core worlds along multiple vectors. At current rate of expansion, they will reach the primary colony clusters within 48 standard hours. The implications of that statement sent shockwaves through the assembled council members. The core worlds represented the heart of galactic civilization, home to trillions of beings and the repositories of knowledge accumulated over millions of years. If these entities could destroy the Outer Rim colonies, there was no reason to believe they would stop before reaching the most important worlds in the galaxy. "What are our defensive capabilities?" Speaker Thranks demanded. The silence that followed was more frightening than any alarm. Sarah watched as representatives of species that had conquered physics, mastered energy manipulation, and built civilizations that spanned star systems struggled to answer what should have been a simple question. The truth was that the galaxy had been at peace for so long that most species had forgotten what large-scale warfare looked like. There had been minor conflicts, territorial disputes, and occasional piracy problems, but nothing that required the kind of coordinated military response that would be needed to face this threat. The Zilithian Collective had the most advanced technology, but their crystalline forms were not designed for combat. The Corvan Empire had the deepest knowledge base, but they had not fought a real war in over 50,000 years. The other species had their own specialized advantages, but none of them translated into the kind of raw military capability that would be needed to stop entities that could apparently ignore the laws of physics. "We need to evacuate the core worlds," the hegemony representative suggested, its voice distorted by the breathing apparatus that allowed it to survive in the chamber's oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere. "Our deep space habitats could support the population until we can develop countermeasures." "Countermeasures against what?" Ambassador Crix's translated voice carried patterns of crystalline frustration. "We do not even understand what these entities are, much less how to fight them. Our weapons are designed to work within the known laws of physics. These things appear to operate outside those constraints." Sarah found herself studying the tactical display with the kind of analytical mindset that had been drilled into her during her years in the Mars Colony Defense Force. The pattern of destruction was devastating, but it was not random. The entities were following logical attack vectors, which meant they had weaknesses. Everything that could think and plan could be outthought and outplanned, given enough time and information. The problem was that time was the one resource the galaxy did not have. At the current rate of expansion, the entities would reach the most important worlds in the galaxy within days, not the years that would be needed to develop entirely new technologies and strategies. "Council Speaker," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the rising panic in the chamber. Every being in the room turned to stare at her. For a moment, Sarah felt the weight of their attention, the combined intelligence of species that had been mastering the universe while humanity was still learning to make fire. "Commander Chen," Speaker Thranks replied, his tone suggesting polite interest, mixed with the kind of patience that adults show toward children who want to contribute to serious conversations. "We appreciate your concern, but this is a matter for species with relevant expertise." "With respect, Council Speaker," Sarah said, moving closer to the central display. "Relevant expertise seems to be exactly what we're lacking here. You have species that can manipulate matter, think in parallel processing streams, and access millions of years of genetic memory. But none of that is helping against these entities." Ambassador Crix's crystalline form pulsed with what Sarah was beginning to recognize as mild irritation. "And what exactly do humans propose to contribute to this situation? You have been in space for barely a century. Your longest military conflict lasted less than a decade. What could your species possibly know about threats of this magnitude?" Sarah looked at the spreading pattern of red indicators on the tactical display, thinking about every military history course she had ever taken, every crisis simulation she had participated in, and every impossible situation that humanity had somehow managed to survive throughout their violent, chaotic, and ultimately successful history. "We know about fighting wars we cannot win," she said quietly. "We know about facing enemies that are bigger, stronger, and more advanced than we are. And we know about refusing to give up even when logic says we should." The chamber fell silent as Sarah walked to the central command console and began calling up data streams that showed the detailed specifications of human military capabilities. It was not an impressive list compared to the technologies available to other species, but it was real, and it was immediately available. "You have 48 hours before these entities reach your core worlds," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the crisp, authoritative tone that had served her well during crisis situations on Mars. "You can spend that time trying to evacuate trillions of beings to deep space habitats, or you can spend it fighting back. The choice is yours." She turned to face the assembled delegates, all of whom were staring at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright disbelief. "But if you choose to fight, you're going to need someone who knows how to fight dirty, fight desperate, and fight with whatever tools happen to be available. Someone who has experience fighting battles that should be impossible to win." Sarah gestured toward the tactical display, where the red indicators continued to spread like an infection across the galaxy. "I cannot promise that we can stop these entities. I cannot even promise that we understand what they are or how to fight them. But I can promise that humanity knows how to try, even when trying seems pointless." The silence stretched on as the assembled representatives processed what Sarah had just said. She could see them accessing databases, consulting with their colleagues, and running probability calculations that undoubtedly showed that humanity's chances of success were effectively zero. Finally, it was Speaker Threnks who broke the silence. "Commander Chen," he said slowly, "are you suggesting that humanity is volunteering to lead the galaxy's defense against these entities?" Sarah looked at the tactical display one more time, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the reasons why trusting humanity with this kind of responsibility was probably a terrible idea, and all the arguments that the Council had made just an hour earlier about humanity's lack of readiness for galactic responsibilities. Then she thought about the spreading pattern of destruction, the billions of beings who would die if the entities were not stopped, and the simple fact that sometimes the only choice was between trying and giving up. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what I am suggesting." The transition from diplomatic failure to military command happened faster than Sarah had thought possible. Within 6 hours of her offer to lead the galaxy's defense, she found herself aboard the Zilithian Collective's most advanced command vessel, surrounded by technologies that humanity would not develop for centuries, and commanding resources that represented the combined military might of dozens of different civilizations. The irony was not lost on her. That morning, she had been told that humanity was too primitive to join the galactic community. Now, she was being asked to save that same community from destruction. The command ship itself was a marvel of crystalline engineering. Instead of traditional metal corridors and compartments, the Zilithians had grown their vessel from living crystal that responded to thought and intention. Sarah could walk through walls that became permeable at her approach, access data streams by simply placing her hand on certain surfaces, and communicate with the ship's intelligence through a combination of verbal commands and directed mental focus. It should have taken months to learn how to operate such advanced technology. Instead, the Zilithians had rigged together a crude interface that allowed Sarah to access the ship's systems through something resembling a standard human computer terminal. It was like controlling a symphony orchestra through a child's toy piano, but it worked well enough to give her the basic command capabilities she needed. The bridge was a spherical chamber at the heart of the ship, with control surfaces and display screens arranged in three-dimensional patterns that could be reconfigured in real time based on tactical needs. Sarah stood at the center of the sphere, surrounded by holographic displays that showed the current state of the galactic defense effort. It was not an encouraging picture. The entities had continued their advance while the Council was organizing their response, and 3 more colony clusters had gone silent in the past few hours. The pattern of destruction showed no signs of slowing down, and long-range sensors were detecting massive energy signatures moving toward the core worlds along multiple attack vectors. But for the first time since the crisis began, Sarah was looking at resources that might actually be capable of mounting a meaningful defense. The combined fleets of the Galactic Council represented firepower that could shatter planets, defensive systems that could protect entire star systems, and sensor networks that could track individual molecules across light years of space. The problem was coordination. Each species had developed their military technologies according to their own evolutionary needs and cultural preferences. The Zilithians fought with crystalline ships that could phase in and out of normal space-time. The Corvan Empire used vessels that were essentially mobile libraries, capable of analyzing any threat and developing countermeasures based on millions of years of accumulated knowledge. The Threx Collective deployed swarm tactics with thousands of small, highly maneuverable fighters that operated with perfect coordination. Getting all of these different military philosophies to work together should have been impossible. Sarah's solution was elegantly simple. She did not even try. Instead of attempting to integrate the different species' military capabilities into a unified force, she divided the available fleets into specialized task forces, each built around a single species' strengths and assigned to missions that played to those advantages. The Zilithian crystalline ships were perfect for reconnaissance and hit-and-run attacks. Their ability to phase between dimensions made them nearly impossible for the entities to target effectively, and their advanced sensor systems could gather detailed intelligence about the enemy's capabilities. The Corvan knowledge ships became mobile command centers, tasked with analyzing the data gathered by the Zilithian scouts and developing tactical recommendations based on their vast databases of military history. The Threx swarms were assigned to defensive positions around the core worlds, where their coordination and numbers could create overlapping fields of fire that would be difficult for any attacking force to penetrate. Sarah kept the human forces for herself. Compared to the advanced technologies available to other species, humanity's military capabilities were laughably primitive. Their ships were crude, fusion-powered vessels that could barely achieve faster-than-light travel. Their weapons were simple kinetic and energy systems that any other species could have designed millennia earlier. Their sensors and communication systems were so limited that they could barely coordinate operations across a single star system, much less multiple sectors. But humanity's ships had one advantage that no other species could match. They were crewed by beings who had evolved to fight hopeless battles and somehow find ways to win them anyway. Sarah positioned the human fleets at the most dangerous assignments, the places where the entity's advance was strongest and the chances of survival were lowest. It was not because she considered human lives to be more expendable than those of other species, but because she knew that humans would continue fighting even in situations where other species would logically retreat. The first major engagement took place at the Kepler 442 system, where one of the largest entity formations was advancing toward a cluster of heavily populated Corvan worlds. Sarah's tactical plan was simple: use the Zilithian scouts to identify the entity's movement patterns. Deploy the human fleets as a blocking force to slow their advance, and then bring in the Corvan knowledge ships to deliver targeted strikes based on whatever weaknesses the engagement revealed. It was a plan that had almost no chance of success, but it was also the only plan available. Sarah watched the engagement unfold through the command ship's holographic displays, feeling the weight of command responsibility that came with ordering thousands of beings into battle against an enemy that no one understood. The human fleets moved into position with the kind of desperate courage that had characterized her species' approach to impossible situations throughout their history. The first contact with the entities was unlike anything that had been recorded in galactic military history. The creatures did not behave like any known form of life. They moved through space without visible means of propulsion, ignored defensive barriers that should have been impenetrable, and seemed to absorb energy attacks without taking any detectable damage. But Sarah's tactical plan had not been based on the assumption that human weapons could destroy the entities. Instead, she had positioned her forces to learn as much as possible about the enemy's capabilities, even if that learning came at a terrible cost. The human ships engaged the entities at point-blank range, absorbing massive damage while their sensors recorded every detail of the encounters. Sarah watched as ship after ship was consumed by the advancing enemy, but each loss provided additional data about the entity's attack methods, movement patterns, and energy signatures. The Corvin knowledge ships analyzed the incoming data in real time, their vast databases searching for any precedent, any pattern, any weakness that could be exploited. For hours, the analysis produced nothing but confirmation that the entities operated outside all known principles of physics and biology. Then, 43 minutes into the engagement, one of the Corvin analysts detected something that changed everything. Command: "This is Knowledge Ship Deep Current of Ancient Memory." The transmission came through with the kind of excitement that suggested a major breakthrough. "We have identified a consistent pattern in the entity's energy absorption behavior. They appear to be selectively consuming specific types of quantum signatures while ignoring others." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she processed the implications of that statement. If the entities were selective about what they consumed, that meant they had limitations, and limitations meant vulnerabilities. "Can you identify which quantum signatures they ignore?" she asked. "Working on it now," came the reply. "We need more data points to establish a definitive pattern." Sarah looked at the tactical display, where the human fleets were continuing their desperate holding action against odds that would have caused any rational military force to retreat hours earlier. Her ships were taking massive casualties, but they were buying time for the Corvin analysis to continue. "All human vessels," she broadcast on the general command frequency, "maintain engagement for another 20 minutes. We're on the verge of a breakthrough." It was exactly the kind of order that highlighted the difference between human military philosophy and that of other species. No other civilization would have asked their forces to continue fighting in a situation where survival was impossible. But the human captains acknowledged her transmission without hesitation and continued their attacks with the kind of stubborn determination that had characterized their species' approach to survival for millions of years. 18 minutes later, the Corvin analysis produced results that revolutionized the entire galactic understanding of the entities. "Command, we have identified the pattern," Deep Current of Ancient Memory reported. "The entities selectively consume quantum signatures associated with advanced technology and complex information structures. They ignore primitive energy patterns, basic molecular configurations, and simple quantum states." Sarah understood immediately. The entities were not just destroying colonies at random. They were specifically targeting the advanced civilizations that had developed sophisticated technology and complex information systems. They were predators that fed on advancement itself. "That explains why they ignored the outer worlds with primitive settlements," Sarah said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "They're attracted to technological sophistication." "Confirmed," came the reply. "The more advanced a civilization becomes, the more attractive it appears to these entities." Sarah looked at the tactical display with new understanding. The entities were advancing along vectors that would take them directly to the most advanced worlds in the galaxy. They were not just attacking colonies. They were hunting down the species that had achieved the highest levels of technological and cultural development. which meant that humanity, with their crude technology and primitive capabilities, was essentially invisible to the predators. "All human vessels," Sarah broadcast, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had just realized that the impossible might actually be possible. "New tactical directive. Power down all advanced systems. Switch to manual navigation and primitive weapons systems. We're going to fight this enemy with technology they cannot see." The next phase of the battle was unlike anything that had ever been recorded in galactic military history. Human ships, operating with fusion reactors that were barely more sophisticated than campfires by galactic standards, began engaging entities that had consumed some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. And for the first time since the crisis began, the entities showed signs of damage. Sarah's primitive kinetic weapons, guided by manual targeting systems that any other species would have replaced with automated controls millennia earlier, began finding their marks against entities that had ignored far more sophisticated attacks. The creature's ability to absorb and redirect energy seemed to be calibrated for advanced technology, leaving them vulnerable to weapons that were too simple to register as threats. The engagement at Kepler 442 became a turning point in the war. Human forces, fighting with technology that was laughably primitive by galactic standards, proved capable of damaging enemies that had seemed invincible against more advanced weapons. But winning a single battle was not the same as winning a war. The entities were still advancing on multiple fronts, and there were not enough human ships to defend every threatened world. Sarah needed a strategy that could protect the entire galaxy, using resources that were, by any rational measure, completely inadequate for the task. Her solution was characteristically human. Instead of trying to fight the entities directly, she would use their own predatory behavior against them. Working with the Corvin knowledge ships, Sarah developed a plan to create false targets that would attract the entities away from the core worlds. Using primitive technology to generate energy signatures that mimicked advanced civilizations, human forces would establish decoy installations throughout the galaxy's outer regions. The entities would be drawn to these false targets, where they would find nothing but primitive technology that they could not consume. Meanwhile, the real advanced civilizations would power down their most sophisticated systems and operate at technological levels that would make them invisible to the predators. It was a strategy that could only work because humanity was uniquely suited to operate at primitive technological levels while still maintaining effective military capabilities. Other species had become so dependent on their advanced systems that they would be helpless without them. Humans had been fighting wars with crude weapons and basic technology for most of their history. The implementation of Sarah's strategy required the largest coordinated military operation in galactic history. Hundreds of species had to simultaneously power down their most advanced systems while human forces established decoy targets across thousands of star systems. The Galactic Council, which had rejected humanity's membership application just days earlier, now found itself completely dependent on human military leadership to coordinate the defense of their entire civilization. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. Over the following weeks, Sarah's strategy proved increasingly effective. The entities were drawn to the decoy targets, where they found themselves unable to feed on the primitive technology they encountered. Meanwhile, human forces operating at technological levels that made them invisible to the predators began systematically hunting down isolated entity formations. It was a slow, dangerous process that cost thousands of lives and required constant coordination across the entire galaxy. But for the first time since the crisis began, the entity's advance was not just slowed, but actually reversed. The final decisive engagement took place in the galactic core itself, where the largest concentration of entities had gathered around what they apparently believed to be the most technologically advanced worlds in the galaxy. Sarah's forces surrounded the creatures using decoy signals and primitive weapons. then executed a coordinated attack that destroyed the primary entity formation in a battle that lasted 72 continuous hours. When the fighting finally ended, the galaxy was saved. The entity threat had been neutralized, the core worlds were secure, and billions of beings owed their lives to a species that had been considered too primitive for galactic citizenship just weeks earlier. Sarah stood once again in the Galactic Council chambers, but the atmosphere was completely different from her first appearance. The delegates who had dismissed humanity's application now looked at her with expressions of respect, gratitude, and more than a little embarrassment. "Commander Chen," Speaker Threnx said, his voice carrying none of the patronizing patience that had characterized their earlier interaction, "the Council would like to formally thank humanity for their service to the galactic community. Your species' actions have saved countless lives and preserved our civilization. We would also like to reconsider your application for Council membership," Ambassador Crix added, his crystalline form pulsing with patterns that Sarah now understood to indicate deep respect. "It appears that our initial assessment of humanity's capabilities was incomplete." Sarah looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of species that had mastered physics, conquered space, and built civilizations that spanned star systems. A few weeks earlier, she would have been thrilled to hear those words. Galactic Council membership had been humanity's greatest aspiration. Now, she found herself thinking about all the ways that advanced technology could become a weakness rather than a strength. She thought about the entities that fed on sophistication and complexity, and about the advantages that came from being underestimated by potential enemies. "Thank you for the offer," Sarah said finally. "But I think humanity might be more valuable to the galactic community as independent allies rather than full council members. Someone needs to maintain the primitive technologies and simple strategies that more advanced species tend to forget. Someone needs to be ready for the next threat that feeds on sophistication." The silence that followed was different from the dismissive quiet that had greeted her earlier presentation. This time, the delegates were considering her words with the kind of serious attention that they might give to wisdom from their most respected colleagues. "Perhaps," Deep Current of Ancient Memory suggested quietly, "advancement is not always the same thing as improvement." Sarah smiled as she gathered her materials and prepared to return to Earth. Humanity had failed to join the galactic community, but they had succeeded in something far more important. They had proven that there was value in being underestimated, strength in simplicity, and power in the kind of stubborn determination that refused to give up even when logic suggested surrender was the only rational choice. The galaxy was safe, and humanity had found their place in it, not as junior members of an advanced civilization, but as the guardians who would be ready when the next impossible threat emerged from the unknown depths of space. As she walked toward the transportation hub, Sarah could hear the council beginning a new discussion about the balance between advancement and security, about the dangers of becoming too sophisticated for their own good, and about the value of maintaining connections to their more primitive roots. It was exactly the kind of conversation that would never have happened if humanity had been granted membership and invited to join the ranks of advanced civilizations. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the best way to serve a community was to remain just outside it, ready to offer a different perspective when the conventional wisdom proved inadequate. Behind her, the Galactic Council continued their deliberations. But for the first time in their history, they were discussing the advantages of being primitive rather than advanced. It was a conversation that would reshape galactic civilization for millennia to come, all because one species had been too stubborn to accept that they were not ready for the challenges they faced. In the end, humanity had not just saved the galaxy. They had reminded it of something that all the advanced civilizations had forgotten, that sometimes the best solutions come not from sophistication, but from the simple refusal to give up when faced with impossible odds. The monsters had come, The galaxy had mocked the humans right up until they needed them, and in the end, it was humanity's primitive stubbornness that had saved them all.